is that which the breeze on the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses.
Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam.
In full glory reflected, now shines on the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh, long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, see it ever when freemen shall stand between their loved homes, and while war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the hem-rescued land praise the God that hath made and preserved us a nation. They've crossed the rivers, they have put in gun, and this the unconquered King God is our trust, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave. For the land of the free and the When Britain first and has no man, arose from out the azure main, arose from out the azure main. This was the charter of the land, and guardian angels sang the strain. Still more majestic shall thou rise, for dreadful from each foreign stroke, for dreadful from each foreign stroke. As the blast that tears the skies, serves not to root thy native oak. The muses still with freedom found shall to thy happy coast repair, shall to thy happy coast repair. Blessed I with matchless beauty crowned, and manly hearts to guard the fair.
der Schön.